Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. This is Beth Johnson with JBS International. Thank you for joining today's Hope Navigator Informational and Pre-Work webinar. Before we begin, we'd like to review a couple of housekeeping items. Please note that all participant lines will be muted upon entry and will be muted for the duration of the webinar. But we want to hear from you, so we encourage you to please submit questions related to the content of today's presentation at any time via the chat feature. To open your chat window, please click on the chat icon located at the bottom center of your Zoom toolbar window. We will address as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. There will be one polling question launched towards the end of the webinar, allowing 15 to 30 seconds for a response to the question. If you experience any technical issues during the webinar, please message us using the chat feature or email us at ovc-tta@jbsinternational.com. Also, today's webinar is being recorded for sharing. The recording and presentation slides, along with other resources, will be available in the coming weeks. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Chan Hellman, Professor of Social Work at the University of Oklahoma and Director of the Hope Research Center, and Dr. Angela Pharris, Assistant Professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Oklahoma and Director of the Center for Child Welfare Training and Senior Research Fellow at the Hope Research Center. Thank you, Chan.
Thank you, and welcome to this training. And thank you for taking some time out of your day and your busy schedules to learn a little bit about the introduction to this concept of hope. And so a little more about my background, sort of as a precursor to the hope presentation. I have been with the University of Oklahoma for about 20 years. And during that time, I have focused most of my work in partnering with community agencies, human service, nonprofit organizations, primarily evaluating outcomes and impact of program services on clients and the community. Most of that work has been in very high trauma and adversity situations, such as domestic violence, child maltreatment, homelessness, food insecurity, etc. And I start that for a couple of reasons. One, I haven't always been interested in this concept of hope, but I have spent my entire career focused in these spaces. At the Hope Research Center, where we've been doing hope work for about 15 years, we have been really focused on three central themes. The first is what is hope and why does it matter for children, for adults, and families? How does trauma and adversity rob us of the capacity for hope? And then more importantly, how can we use simple strategies to nurture and restore that hope? Again, focusing on children, adults, and families. One of the things that my colleague and I, Dr. Angela Pharris, have been focused on is building and testing these strategies that we want to make accessible to everybody in our community. So strategies that can be used by case managers, strategies that can be used by supervisors and directors, teachers, counselors, coaches, youth ministers, etc. So today I'm going to give you an introduction to this concept of hope, the science of hope. I do not intend for it to be an academic presentation, rather a summary of that 15 years of work. So I plan to speak for about an hour, roughly, introducing this concept. I do plan to use the chat function throughout the presentation, so I'll give you a little bit of a heads up, but there are certain parts of this PowerPoint where I will ask you to engage with me a little bit. And then, as mentioned, towards the end, we're happy to take on question and answers. One thing that I will also highlight is that for several years, we have really been working closely with various organizations to create a hope-centered organizational framework. so that we're using the science of hope as a guide or as a framework for action to improve not only client outcomes, but also focused on the well-being of the workforce. And so in the state of Oklahoma, our governor and first lady have made the commitment to become a hope-centered state. Very recently, our governor highlighted the science of hope in his State of the State address. And Dr. Pharris and I have been tasked to train all 112 state agencies, 35,000 state employees, executive leadership teams, and then ultimately we've trained a little over 2,000 Hope Navigators to this point. And we'll spend a little bit of time towards the end of the presentation talking a little bit more about that work, and in particular, the Hope Navigator framework. So let's see, there we go. So roughly 15 years ago, I was invited by an organization to conduct a housing needs assessment. This is an organization that provides services to individuals living with HIV and AIDS. And more importantly, the clients being served by this nonprofit organization were also experiencing fairly extreme adversity associated with poverty and other related issues. So a lot of the clients are making daily decisions about food and nutrition, access to healthcare, as well as housing. And it was during this time frame that I was introduced to this concept of hope. More specifically, I was fortunate enough to interact with one of the clients who was receiving services. And this young man, his name was David, and David is the one who really changed my life, both personally and professionally, around this science of hope. So I'm a psychologist by training. And so as I was having this very informal, brief conversation with David, he shared with me that he was 19 years old, and 3 months earlier, he learned that he was HIV positive. Now, as a psychologist, as a program evaluator, I was immediately drawn to this question, that is, what is wrong with you? And one of the reasons that I was so focused on this is because this is typically how we evaluate the effectiveness of programs. That is, we identify what is the adversity that promotes distress, and that if we can demonstrate a reduction in that distress, that is typically how we evaluate the effectiveness of programs. So as I'm listening to David and a little bit of his story, I'm listening for depression, anxiety, etc. David further shares with me that 2 weeks earlier, he had disclosed to his parents that he was HIV positive. They'd kicked him out of the house, and he had spent these last 2 weeks homeless here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, again, as I'm really focused in on this adversity and really trying to identify social isolation, etc., David does something in this moment that, again, changed my life tremendously. David began to talk about his future. And in the presence of all of this adversity, he shared with me that he was enrolling in the local community college. That while he was homeless, he had gone to the college, he had made an appointment and met with an academic counselor. He had identified his major, and he had enrolled in the first semester of courses. And as David is sharing this future expectation with me, it really began to occur that I'd spent my entire professional career focused on this question of what is wrong with you. And what maybe would have been perhaps a better question, and one that I became very targeted towards, was really beyond the trauma-aware perspective of what has happened to you, but rather what is right with you. And I began to really think about what were the strengths that David possessed that allowed him to navigate his adversity and still have this future expectation. And it was David in this brief, roughly 10-minute conversation that introduced me to the concept of hope, but also changed the way I now evaluate and work with programs and services. Now, we're all familiar with the adverse childhood experiences. Most of our research incorporates assessing the exposure to adversity, whether it's through adverse childhood experiences or perhaps the more robust polyvictimization screening assessment that OVC and the Family Justice Center model is developing and testing. But most of you are very familiar with this framework. And so the reason I just kind of want to start here is to really lay the foundation of this work that we've been doing around the science of hope. Now, two things that I'd really like for you to consider and challenge you to think about is number one, for us, hope is not the outcome. We're not studying hope just for the sake of whether or not we can nurture hope. Rather, the outcome that we are always focused on is hope as a process that leads to well-being. So there are over 2,000 published research studies that demonstrate that our capacity for hope is one of the strongest predictors of our capacity to thrive, whether that is with children, adults, or families. That hope is a significant protective and coping resource that can be nurtured. The second thing that I want to make sure we understand is that as I talk about this concept of hope, that I'm not talking about or advocating in any way that hope is really about the power of positive thinking. And so as we begin to explore the concept of hope, I just really challenge you to consider hope as a framework for action. And so staying with this idea of the adverse childhood experience, for instance, again, you're all familiar with this concept, so I'm not going to spend any time. We know about its prevalence in our communities. We all know about the dosage or the cumulative effect and its exponential effect on negative well-being indicators, physically, psychologically, or socially. What I will ask you to consider is that the latest data that we found from the Center for Disease Control identifies that from a national perspective, the average ACE score among adults is a 1.61, so just under 2 of those adversities on average. Now, I will share with you that I'm getting ready to ask you to engage in the chat function, so just a little bit of a heads up to get ready. So I'm going to ask you to respond here in just a moment. But I want to share with you some of the spaces that we're really focused on in studying hope, and in particular about the capacity to nurture and restore hope in some really difficult spaces. So you remember that the national average for the adverse childhood experience is just under 2 adversities. One of the things that I've been blessed to be a part of is serve as the lead researcher with children exposed to domestic violence, in particular, the Camp Hope model from the Family Justice Center Alliance. And roughly 3,000 children across 26 states. And their average ACE score for this population is significantly higher than the national average. I just finished a study a few weeks ago working with an organization that is providing resources and program services to parents who have had their children removed. And in that particular sample, the average ACE score was, again, significantly higher than that national average. And then this is Oklahoma, and this is our foster youth who are aging out of the system. I highlight this because in Oklahoma, our Department of Human Services really is leading the way. They chose 3 years ago to become the first Hope-centered state agency. And the foster youth program, it was one of the very first programs we began to work with. So my colleague, Dr. Angela Pharris, is leading this effort and this research. But these are foster children between the ages of 14 and 17. And you can see that their average ACE score is, again, significantly higher than that national average. So this is the part where I'm going to ask you to engage in the chat function. And so for this group of foster youth between the ages of 14 and 17, again, this is Oklahoma. But what I'd ask you is what would you estimate is the average number of placements experienced by this group of youth, again, between the ages of 14 and 17? Again, just type it into the chat function. Very good. Thank you all very much. That's very helpful. And so you can see the numbers going through there. And as those continue to scroll, as those continue to roll across, what I will tell you is that in Oklahoma, the average number of placements for foster youth between the ages of 14 and 17 is 22 placements on average. And by the way, this is when Dr. Pharris removed 3 individuals who had in excess of 50 plus different placements. My point is that we experience adversity at a much more profound level than just the adverse childhood experience. And so what we're really trying to do is understand in spaces of despair, spaces of apathy, of anger, of survival, how do we nurture and restore that hope? That has really been the focus for us. Now, on a personal level, I'm not generally interested in the adverse childhood experience. I'm not generally interested in which of the adversity or which combination of the adversity. What I'm much more interested as a psychologist, but also as a program evaluator, is how that exposure to adversity shows up. How does it impact the way in which children, adults, and families engage in program services? So for instance, in the upper left-hand corner, you see lower trust. And so one of our early publications demonstrated that children and adults with an average ACE, with an ACE score of 1 or higher report significantly lower levels of trust in professionals. So I'll be a little bit more blunt on that, that these children and adults report significantly lower levels of trust in you. And so if I don't trust you, how does that impact the way in which I engage in help-seeking behaviors? If I don't trust you, chances are it's going to influence the way I communicate with you, the way I engage in those program services. So again, these are the spaces that we're interested in, how exposure to these adversities rob us of our capacity for hope. One of our more recent publications that came out over this last year, we found that the adverse childhood experience led to an insecure attachment, which led to lower hope. And this is probably no big surprise that exposure to childhood adversity leads to an insecure attachment. The perspective of this study was that we didn't study clients. We actually studied judges and attorneys and law enforcement and advocates. We actually studied professionals who are in service professions. And so it's just a reminder that these adversities impact all of us. So one of the things that that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of is a community-wide, a statewide initiatives of increasing this trauma awareness, the idea of trauma-informed care. And as we have grown in our understanding and exposure of this, we're oftentimes left with this question of, okay, we understand trauma, we understand this adversity. The question becomes, what do we do about it? What do we do about it from an organizational perspective? What do we do it from a community? And then more importantly, some of the work we're interested in is how do we help influence the way systems respond to trauma? And for us, and the primary purpose of this training is to really advocate that hope is what we do about this, that creating a hope-centered and trauma-informed response format is the way in which we design program services. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat function again. And before I give you the definition of hope, what I'd like to do is just ask you to think about this word hope. And just in using the chat function, why don't you share just a few things that, that you associate with hope? What comes to mind when you think about this idea of hope? And just, again, use the chat function. So thank you, Kelly. The ability to look at positive things in the future. Wishful, thank you very much for that. Future, very good. Very good, thank you. And you can see the terms and the concepts that are flowing through. These are very common when we give the hope training. These are very common responses that we see associated with this concept of hope. So let me ask an additional question as you're typing. Is hope a feeling? Is it an emotion? Or is hope a way of thinking? What are your thoughts there? Is hope an emotion or is hope a mindset? Both, yes to all. The most common response we get. So thank you, thank you. Yeah, thank you all so much for engaging in the chat function. That makes it so much easier as a presenter, especially in Zoom. So thank you all for that. What I will tell you is that we treat hope as a mindset, that hope is a cognitive process. Now, this is a really critical takeaway in this entire presentation. So first and foremost is that if hope was an emotion, if it was a feeling that we had, at best, we'd be able to help people manage it. But because hope is a mindset, because hope is a cognitive process, we know that it can be taught. This is a critical takeaway. That is, hope is something that can be taught. And what I will share with you is that over the years and working with 3- and 4-year-olds across the lifespan, we can demonstrate that hope can indeed be taught, that we can actually nurture and restore hope across the lifespan. So here is the definition that we use. Hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that we have the power to make it so. So 2 important takeaways from this definition. First is the idea that hope is the belief that the future will be better than today. If we stopped there in the definition, that really is optimism. That's an optimistic expectation for the future. Hope goes beyond optimism by including the latter part of the definition, that you have the power to make it so. So in this way, we know that hope is about taking action to pursue that future. Now, as you're considering this definition, hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that we have the power to make it so. Just know that this is where we study how hope is robbed, how trauma and adversity rob us of the belief that the future can be better. That trauma and adversity has the potential to rob us of the perspective that we have the power to change our future. So these are the things that we spend our time focused on. Now, one of the things that I really love about the concept of hope is its simplicity. It's based upon these three simple concepts: goals, pathways, and willpower. First and foremost is the idea that goals are the cornerstone of everything that we do about hope. So each and every one of us, from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to bed, we are all pursuing goals in our life, whether in the short term or long term, but each of us are goal driven. The question with hope is whether or not we have the ability or the capacity to identify the pathways or the roadmaps that we're going to use to get there from here. Pathways thinking is really the strategizing piece of hope. Pathways thinking also includes the ability to identify barriers or obstacles and to engage in problem solving to either overcome those obstacles or to find alternative pathways. This is pathways thinking. Willpower is really the motivational piece of hope. It is the ability that we have, or the capacity that we have, to dedicate the mental energy, our attention and intention on those pathway pursuits. And I'll describe that a little bit more shortly. By the way, I will point out that hope theory was originated by Professor Rick Snyder. And the correct term is actually agency, to be agentic. I have found that when I work with so many human service nonprofit organizations, state agencies, school districts, probation officers, the courts, that when I use the word agency, we sometimes confuse it with referring to the organization or this cognitive process. So I just prefer to use the word willpower just for simplicity of understanding. These are the three important components: goals, pathways, and willpower. Now, it's important to understand that when we're talking about hope, that both willpower and pathways are required in order for us to be hopeful. So for instance, it may be that I have a lot of desire for an outcome that I spend a lot of mental energy on that outcome. But if I don't know how to get there from here, we would actually classify this as lower hope. So for instance, in a child reunification scenario, it may be that a parent says something like, "I want my children back, you guys just won't let me." So what we hear is the willpower, the mental energy towards the goal of getting our children back. But the statement that "you guys won't let me" is a pathways statement. Now, alternatively, when I've studied batterer treatment programs, the batterer treatment intervention is a pathway to achieving the goal of family safety. And that the program services are in fact pathways. The difficulty is that sometimes batterers may not have a whole lot of motivation or energy to engage in a batterer treatment program. So in this case, the pathways are available, but the willpower is low. Again, we consider this to be lower levels of hope. You have to have both willpower and pathways thinking. Now, two important takeaways from this particular graph. First and foremost, when I began to think about hope in this way, goals, pathways, and willpower, it occurred to me almost immediately that this model was the perfect description of the community agencies, of the nonprofit human service organizations that these organizations, these program services are in fact pathways to goal attainment. The hard work is the willpower piece. So when Dr. Pharris and I are doing training from a hope-centered perspective, one of the first things that we want to make sure people understand is that when we're training on hope, we're not necessarily asking you to think about one more new thing that you may get to do or have to do. What we're really asking you to do early on is to consider this language of hope as a description of what you already do. And that because this is a description of the work that takes place in your organizations and your programs, that you now have this language of that activity, hope, that has a robust body of science, roughly 2,000 published studies, demonstrating that our capacity to hope is one of the most significant predictors of our capacity to thrive. So that's really the first important takeaway. The next takeaway, I'll just use it this way, and I'll ask you again to use the chat function, but just think about how we use the word hope every day in our conversations. So what are some common phrases? You've probably used them today already, but what are some common phrases that we use with each other around this concept of hope? So for instance, yeah, I hope to. Very good, Laura. Thank you. Hope you have a great day. Yes, Amanda, thank you. I hope all is well. Being from Oklahoma, one of the things that we say sometimes frequently is, I hope there are no tornadoes today. And so within this framework, let's use hope and think about that statement, that I hope there are no tornadoes today. So for instance, my goal or desire is that there are no severe thunderstorms. And I have a lot of mental energy dedicated to that. I spend a lot of time focusing on that. But I have absolutely no control over the weather. I have no pathways. So what I want you to think about is how we typically use the word hope in this context, when what we're really referring to is wishing. So what I want us to understand is the clear distinction between hoping and wishing. Wishing exists when we have a desire for an outcome, but no strategies. Wishing is passive towards the goal. Hope is about taking action to pursue that goal. So this is a very important distinction. So real quickly, I'll highlight how our research has identified the way in which trauma and adversity impact goals, pathways, and willpower. This first one, I think, is probably the most profound discovery that we've made. The very first time I discovered this outcome, I was studying in a child maltreatment context, a parenting program for parents who were working to reunify with their children. And here's what we find very consistently in our research, that when children, adults, and families are in the presence of adversity, when we are in distress, we are much more likely to set goals that are avoidant in nature. That is, I'm much more likely to set a goal for an outcome I do not want to occur. But what we find is when program services begin to nurture and restore that hope, we see a transition from avoidance to achievement. Now, let me give you a real quick example of how this plays out. So imagine a basketball player who steps out on the court and their mindset is, I want to get the ball and shoot the winning shot for my team. This is an achievement mindset. But imagine the basketball player who steps out on the court and the mindset is, I hope they don't throw me the ball because I'm probably going to lose it and really disappoint my team. This is an avoidant mindset. Now, clearly, what I want you to think about is how those two basketball players behave on the court. One is doing everything they can to get to the ball, and the other one is doing everything they can to achieve, to avoid the ball. Now, think about, for instance, your organizations and your places of work. Is the culture of the work, are the policies and procedures, do they promote achievement for clients and staff? Or do they promote avoidance in some fashion? So as an example, maybe drug court, for instance. Drug court may have a framework that promotes avoidance, that the entire communication and messaging is around avoidance. If you do this, you will go to prison. And so what we're talking about is using hope as a mindset to guide the way we develop programs and we create hope-centered processes to nurture achievement. The other thing that we found is that when we're in the presence of distress, we are much better at short-term goal setting than we are at long-term goal setting. When children, adults, and families are in survival mode, long-term goal setting typically has no relevance. That when I'm in survival, today is what matters. The next 15 minutes is what I am focused on. We also find that, and this is especially true with children, that in trauma and adversity, the pathways thinking tends to become interrupted. And then finally, this idea of willpower. This is another area that I find really intriguing. First and foremost is the recognition from the research on willpower that our capacity, our mental energy is a limited resource, that you and I only have so much mental energy to give throughout the day. And throughout the day, we are draining our mental energy. We've all gone home at the end of the day mentally exhausted. The difficulty here is that when our willpower is reduced, what we tend to see is that our ability to self-regulate is also reduced. So our capacity to control our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors become challenged. So willpower is a limited resource. The other thing that's very intriguing is the research that demonstrates that our willpower is significantly associated with the glucose in our systems. Now, we all know that glucose is sugar in our system, but it's our source of energy. And that when that glucose is depleted, so too does that willpower. So what it highlights is the significance and importance of nutrition programs or nutrition within the context of our programming. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to use the chat function again. This is a hypothetical example. I want to show you how goals, pathways, and willpower all interact together. And so let's get ready for the chat function. So let me just ask this. How many of you know how to drive or have ever attempted to drive a manual transmission vehicle? So just type that in. Just tell me your experience with that. Very good. Very good. Tried and can't do it. I certainly understand that. Very good. Very good. So many people are saying yes, a few no. Fantastic. So in this hypothetical example, our goal, actually your goal, is you want to drive. And so for all of you who've had this experience, both successfully and unsuccessfully, what I want to ask you is just remember that very first time. Remember that very first attempt at driving a manual transmission vehicle. Remember the anxiety, the fear, the excitement associated with that. Now, if you've never had this experience, you can still participate in this hypothetical example. What I'm just going to ask you to do is just imagine that you're going to drive a manual transmission vehicle for the very first time. So within this example, the only pathway that we have available to us is this manual transmission car. If we're going to achieve our goal, we have to navigate this gearbox. So let me ask this. How many of you can, just in your mind, can you picture the vehicle that has a manual transmission? Can you see it in your mind? Even if you've never driven one, can you picture a vehicle that has a manual transmission? Do you see the pedals on the floor, the clutch, the brake, the gas pedal, and you see the gearbox to the side? So can you imagine yourself sitting in the vehicle, in the driver's seat of this car? And then ultimately, can you imagine yourself actually driving, successfully driving, whether it's luck or you figure it out? Can you just picture that in your mind? And by the way, this highlights one of our important guiding principles that Hope Navigators get a whole curriculum around. But it highlights a guiding principle that imagination is the instrument of hope. Imagination is the instrument of hope. So what we have to do is, once we set the goal, is we have to cast a vision for what goal success is going to be like, how it's going to impact our lives. So let's go through this hypothetical example. You're going to drive a manual transmission vehicle for the very first time. And so let me just add two small pieces of adversity. First and foremost, you are parked uphill. You are parked facing up a significant steep hill. The second form of adversity is, let's go ahead and just imagine that there is a brand new BMW parked immediately behind you. So when you drive this car for the first time, you've got to go uphill and you've got this brand new BMW behind you. So you've got the car started. You're in first gear. You're getting ready to let that clutch out. Remember, you're facing uphill. You've got a BMW immediately behind you. So as you slowly start to let that clutch out, in that moment, what is your goal? And just use the chat function. What is your goal in that moment as you let that clutch out for the very first time? And I'll just ask everybody just to watch as these scroll by. And what I want to highlight, don't stall the car, don't roll backwards, don't hit the BMW. What I want to highlight is that these are all avoidant goals. These are all avoidant goals. And it's just an example that when we are in the presence of stress, it is so natural for us to go into an avoidant framework. Now, what I want to highlight is that not hitting the BMW is a good goal. It is a very good goal to have not hitting this BMW. However, what I want you to recognize is, where is it coming from? And it's coming from fear and uncertainty. So we don't want people to stay here. All right, so let's say you let the clutch out and you stall the car. You didn't hit the BMW, but you killed the engine. So what I want you to think about is, what are you saying to yourself as you had this immediate failure towards driving? What are you saying to yourself about your ability to drive? I can't do it. I'll never be able to get this. It's very frustrated. It's angry, a lot of emotion. But what we ask is, why didn't you give up, right? For those of you who know how to drive, because we desired the goal so much, we didn't give up. We wanted to drive. And so what we know is that the more desirable the goal is, the more likely we are to face adversity to overcome it. So it highlights the importance of the goal. And we have to remember that it's their goal, not our goal for them, that they set the goal in that context. So let's say you start the car back up, you let the clutch out, and this time you lurch forward. You're successful. You're driving uphill. You're successful here. So pull over, turn the car off. Practice makes perfect. So the third time you start the car, you let the clutch out, and you kill the engine again. But what I want you to think about is, what are you saying to yourself now about your ability to drive? And what we tend to see is that people make a little bit of a shift to, well, I've done this before, I can do this again. And so what I want to point out is, this is the next guiding principle in our curriculum, and that is hope begets hope. That this one opportunity for success, even if it was luck, demonstrated to us that the future is possible. And so we start to see a shift from the I can't mindset to the I can. And so this is part of that process that hope begets hope. And so pretty soon you learn to drive. Pretty soon you learn that whole process. This is the pathways component. The question is how well can you manage your willpower during this process? How much of your mental energy is required when you first let that clutch out? And the answer is all of it. You have to be able to focus your attention exclusively on that process. And so what I want you to consider is that if hope is a potential language that describes your organization, that your program services are in fact pathways to the goal attainment, then we have to remember that willpower is limited and that many of the clients that we work with are experiencing tremendous amounts of adversity that make taking the very first step or few steps very difficult. Because if I'm navigating being homeless or about to lose my home, or I'm struggling with food insecurity, that being able to focus on program services in your curriculum becomes very difficult because willpower is limited. So let me ask this question. This is another chat function. And so let me just ask you to respond. What is the opposite of hope? What is the opposite of hope? What are your thoughts here? Fear, despair, very good. Despair is the most common response that we get. You'll have to trust that I'm a nurturing professor at the University of Oklahoma, but you're wrong. The loss of hope is actually a process, and the opposite of hope is apathy. Very good, Laura. It's this not caring. It's the idea that I look at a potential goal or pathway, and my mindset is no matter what I do, I'm going to fail, so why try? The loss of hope is a process that goes from hope. Once we begin to experience barriers, it's anger, frustration, anxiety, that if we're unable to overcome that can transition into despair and then ultimately apathy. The problem with despair is that we still have a lot of willpower. We still have a lot of mental energy towards our blocked goal. We just don't have the pathways. So we have part of hope, but not all of it. The difficulty with despair is that it can lead to desperation and to desperate acts. And when we're in desperation, we may grab a hold of pathways that are very dysfunctional for us or for others around us. From a Hope Navigator perspective, when we do the training for the Hope-Centered organization, we actually use this framework to not only talk about how we as individuals lose hope, but how organizations might also be experiencing anger, frustration, and anxiety, or spaces where we see despair in clients or staff, and then ultimately the exposure of apathy. Now, on a very personal level, despair and apathy are the two areas that I am most interested in working. And how do we nurture hope in these difficult spaces? Now, the good news is that hope can be taught. The good news is we know how to actually nurture hope. And it too follows a very simple process. And this is a description of the types of curriculum that we've developed around goal setting, pathways development, taking advantage of imagination as an instrument of hope, and other guiding principles to go through this process of nurturing and restoring hope. I'll show you real quickly where we've done this in some pretty difficult spaces. I'm not going to show you a whole lot of data, just give you a few examples. This is the youth who have been exposed to domestic violence. And so you can see, for instance, the prevalence of adversity for each of the ACE components or categories. So 80% roughly witnessed domestic violence, 50% experiencing verbal abuse, 45% with an incarcerated parent. So pretty high exposure to adversity, more a descriptive of this poly-victimization kind of framework. So the intervention for this group of youth is a hope-centered curriculum where we train camp counselors. So this is an intervention that is partnered with, for instance, a YMCA summer camp. However, this particular week is exclusive for these children exposed to domestic violence. The intervention is not a therapeutic intervention. Rather, it is a challenge by choice that is infused with hope-centered strategies of goal setting and pathways development. So again, children are engaging in zip lining, canoeing, horseback riding, etc. So we measure hope 30 days before the intervention, the last day of the intervention, and then a 30-day follow-up. And by the way, the training for the staff in this particular case is the hope awareness training. It's about a 2 to 3 hour training. So not real in depth. We just expose them to the science. But again, when we measure hope at the 30 days before the event, the last day of the camp, and then a 30-day follow-up. So you can see the significant increase in hope in this simple intervention. Now, I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, this pre-test score, you can see it's the average score of a 25.38. And by the way, we train the Hope Navigators on the whole measurement and assessment component, which is very simple. The assessment for children takes less than 10 minutes to administer and to score it. But this score of a 25 represents the slight hope category, the lower end of hope. And this simple intervention shows a statistically significant increase to a 27.51. The reason I'm highlighting this is because they didn't take children from low hope to high hope. They literally are moving the needle in continuous kinds of activity. But remember, hope is not the outcome. So what I want you to see is that this 2-point increase in hope actually predicted a letter grade change in the classroom. That just by moving the needle changed the child's perspective of the future and their capacity to be empowered to influence that future. That to me is the power and the outcome of hope. So we know how to do this. We know how to nurture hope. We know how to do this process with some very simple strategies that can be used in just minutes. Many school districts have developed little 20-minute hope-centered activities. So it doesn't have to be a framework where you focus on going from low to high. Now, as I'm going to start drawing to a close in my last 5 to 10 minutes, what I want to show you is that with this hope-centered framework, the focus is not just on clients. It is also promoting the well-being of staff, which has been especially true over the last couple of years. Now, I am greatly influenced and a huge fan of Brené Brown's work, but it really helps us sort of contextualize this when we begin to think about, for instance, that it's hard to give what you don't have. And so what we want to do in a hope-centered framework is we want to nurture that hope of staff who are actually doing the hard work with clients. So I'll just show you real quickly some of our data. So oftentimes we get the question of how does hope and resilience related? Are they different? Are they similar? And both hope and resilience are significantly associated with well-being, with staff well-being. But when we build the predictive models, and we've replicated this probably in 20 different settings, And we see the same thing over and over again. So for instance, in this predictive model, a solid line means that it's statistically significant. The dashed line means it's no longer statistically significant. And what we find continuously is that hope tends to be the stronger predictor of staff well-being compared to resilience. What we also know is that hope is a very simple concept centered around goals, pathways, and willpower. Another issue that we find, we've actually published a couple of pieces on hope in the context of burnout. And in this particular data set, what I want you to see are a couple things. One is we're able to classify individuals, employees, into these 4 categories of high hope, moderate hope, slight hope, and then the lower hope category. And what we see is that, for instance, the lower hope individuals or staff are reporting significantly higher rates of adversity. So you can see this association that higher hope individuals report lower levels of burnout. But what I really want you to pay attention to is this significant stair-step difference at each level of hope. Because what it highlights for us, and it highlights as we train organizations, is the idea that you don't have to take employees from low hope to high hope. You literally have to move the needle. So going from low hope to slight hope is a 10-point decrease in burnout. And you can see that at all levels, that just moving the needle is a game changer for staff well-being. We also see a significant predictive association between hope and retention of effective employees. And remember, the simplicity of hope actually provides a framework for action for supervisors, for leaders, to really build and nurture hope in staff. So again, a very similar stair-step approach where we see higher hope individuals reporting significantly higher rates of the intent to remain within the organization. And then I think this is one of the final ones just in this framework of data. But again, notice the significant and the pronounced differences at each level of hope. So for instance, going from low to slight hope produces a 10-point, this is a huge shift in well-being just at the lower levels of hope. So again, what we really try to reinforce is you don't have to summit the mountain. You just have to begin the journey, and good outcomes follow. Now, in working with Hope Navigators and working with organizations, we do have a structured strategy that we've evaluated in sort of moving towards this framework. And you can see that, for instance, today we're doing this awareness component. And then the next phase would ultimately be to identify and then train Hope Navigators. Hope Navigators are not a train the trainer model, although Hope Navigators can help increase the awareness through lunch and learns and other activities that we work with them on. Hope Navigators are intended to be content experts. They take a very deep dive into the science of hope, and they create strategic implementation activities to integrate hope into the policies, into the structures, into program services, oftentimes in areas that already exist. So Hope Navigators are about strategic implementation. So as I'm getting closer again to the end, one of the things that I'll share with you is that, and this is our Department of Human Services, roughly 6,000 employees. And what we were able to do is identify a control group of employees who had no exposure to the HOPE training and then another group of employees who did go through the HOPE training. So the control group has about 700 individuals across the entire organization. And then the remaining, it's a 6,000 person organization. So pretty large sample size. But what I want to share with you is that in this control group design, just exposing staff to the science of HOPE, understanding the language, understanding goals, pathways, and willpower shows a significant difference in burnout. So individuals who go through the training report significantly lower levels of burnout. Equally as important, we see an even more pronounced distinction in secondary traumatic stress. So this particular study that we're actually about to publish demonstrates the effectiveness of HOPE awareness training as a protective factor for the workforce. So when we think about the sample strategies, sample projects that HOPE navigators have undertaken in their organizations, they tend to cluster into 4 areas. And I will tell you that especially over the last couple of years, about 95% of all organizations that we work with, the first goal that they tend to focus on is workforce well-being, followed very closely by program impact types of activities. But you can just see these are some of the activities that existing HOPE navigators have undertaken in their organizations. These lunch and learns, these HOPE awareness activities begin to integrate HOPE assessments into job satisfaction types of surveys. We're working with organizations that actually begin to look at their physical environment in the workplace through this lens of HOPE. And other HOPE navigators have begun to really wrestle with policy and procedures, et cetera. And you can read the others. One of the things that I'm really excited about, and we're seeing some good success, is really changing performance evaluation strategies to create a HOPE-centered process that promotes an ongoing conversation opportunity for supervisors and staff. So again, just a few of those activities. Just quickly, a couple more. We trained the judges in the state of Mississippi and the family court judges across all 82 counties. And their HOPE navigators decided that they wanted to create judicial bench cards so that all judges would have a HOPE-centered bench card. And you can see, for instance, that under these categories, the courtroom as a place of goal setting, what we do is we provide this sort of observe this and ask this. So the idea is that HOPE navigators create actionable steps and strategies to begin deploying HOPE into organizational processes. By the way, other organizations have taken this bench card and adapted it as a supervisor training, so supervisor cheat sheet in working with staff, sort of a HOPE-centered process as well. School districts are using this to really integrate into a HOPE-centered parent-teacher conference framework. And then the back side of this document, front and back document, is just a reminder of the judges of what is HOPE. And you can see the definition, the 3 components, the 6 guiding principles that we teach HOPE navigators, and then a reminder that when they see a youth or a family in the courtroom who appears to be disengaged or hostile or just doesn't seem to care, that is really potentially a form of apathy or low hope and something that the courtroom has some influence on. Our Department of Transportation in Oklahoma created this simple infographic as a strategic communication rollout, one small piece of their entire strategic rollout process, which also includes the QR code that takes the employee to a deeper website further describing what this Department of Transportation is doing. And then finally, and then I'll wrap this up so that we can engage in some question and answer or some discussion. And this is something that Dr. Pharris has been in a leadership role on. And this is our family team meetings. And so we've restructured the way those family team meetings go, in which child welfare workers begin to run the meeting through this lens of hope. Which also includes encouraging the idea that biological and foster parents all have a role to play in setting the goals for what the family is working towards. And so this is part of a trifold informational that everybody gets. So highlighting that basically what people are doing, or Hope Navigators are doing, are taking existing programs and processes and just simply infusing hope into it. Again, you don't have to summit the mountain, you just have to begin the journey. So I guess at this point, I would really enjoy if you have some questions, some comments to get the opportunity to discuss further. So thank you for listening, and let's transition to some Q&A. If there are any. Here they come. Okay, Rox, are you guys gonna catch these, or do you want me to?
Yeah, we can go ahead and read them off. The first one is about a recording of this webinar, and yes, we will send this recording out to all participants. There's a question about, have any studies or work been done with incarcerated individuals?
Oh, I love that. Yes. There's actually a pretty good body of evidence that demonstrates that hope enhancing activities. And so basically the research was focused on repeat offenders, incarcerated offenders. And so they actually had a treatment and a control group. And when they nurtured hope in the treatment group, they reported significantly lower recidivism than the control group. So there is evidence that shows that nurturing hope has positive impact in this space. When I've presented to the sheriff's department out in Washington, the sheriff's comment in a public forum was that if we could nurture hope, he would empty his jail. He felt that hope had that profound of an impact of that. There's multiple other studies, but I'll give you a personal sort of experience that we're having here in Oklahoma. And that is, we trained all of our Department of Corrections leadership team before the holidays this last year. And then after the holidays, we trained our Pardon and Parole Board. Pardon and Parole Board actually had us work with board members to create a hope-centered interview process to assess offender readiness. But what they wanted to do was move 2 years upstream. And because these two agencies now have a shared language around hope, they're actually coming together, developing a case model approach of working with offenders so that there's doing goal setting and pathways development in housing, employment, relationships, various domains of their lives, so that when they get to pardon and parole, they actually have an action plan to participate in that resource. We're also working with transitional housing so that, and the reason I'm excited about that is that it's a system change possibility. But essentially the data is pretty consistent in the criminal justice. we actually have created a whole infographic flyer that summarizes the data in a criminal justice environment that further highlights the effectiveness of this. And we're happy to share that as well.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Chan. There's also a question in here about nurturing hope in survivors of really violent kind of scenarios. So the examples were gun violence or homicide loss. Do you know of any studies that focus on that? I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Yeah, there have been some. There's been a couple of those, and it really allows us to highlight that when we nurture hope, just know that it's not a continuous kind of process. So when somebody is experiencing crisis, such as this extreme violence or crisis, what we're not advocating is that it's an opportunity for us to run up and say, hey, we just need to build hope. I want to make sure we all understand that there is a time and place to do hope, and that in the midst of crisis, it may be safety and security and relationship and other things. What some of the data has demonstrated is that it enhances a coping strategy or a coping mechanism that enhances well-being, but the loss is always there, the tremendous loss associated with violent crime. And so it's going to be an ebb and flow. But what some of that research suggests is that the recovery in that ebb and flow is increased through hope-centered strategy. So not a whole lot of research. I can think of one in particular that I've seen, and it's been some months ago that I've seen that. So thank you for that question.
There was another question asking, can you talk about how this might look with law enforcement or EMS?
Oh, I love that question. First and foremost, I can tell you when we've worked with law enforcement agencies, so for instance, Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, local law enforcement, police department in Tulsa and others. When we first start having conversations, there's a little bit of a reluctance around the concept of hope. What is this hope thing? But what I would tell you is that within 10 minutes of a conversation they're in, within 10 minutes, as they start to listen to the language of hope, first and foremost, most of them get it. They see it on a daily basis, both in the work that they do as first responders in high stress environment. But I will tell you that where I'm most interested, and we're doing this work with OVC and some partners, is we're really focusing on integrating these hope-centered strategies internal or intrinsic to the department first, to really focus on protecting law enforcement, to really enhancing well-being activities, to build buffers to burnout, secondary and primary trauma that they experience. So we're really excited to be working in that space. EMS in particular, I'm not familiar. If we transition into emergency room in hospitals, we actually see very significant improvements in work process efficiency in high stress environments. So that's what I've got so far.
Great, thank you. Is there a specific doctoral program that you would recommend that encompasses hope science?
Yeah, so the doctoral program that we have here at the University of Oklahoma, Tulsa, where I'm at, is a PhD in community and organizational leadership, and the students that I work with are all doing hope stuff. That being said, the University of Kansas used to be the hotbed of all of the work. That's where Rick Snyder was from. Rick Snyder passed away in 2006. And so there aren't really, that I'm aware of, any sort of high focus doctoral training programs. But what we do see is concept of hope being integrated into the doctoral studies across many different programs. So doctoral students have a lot of autonomy in being able to incorporate hope into that context, but there's about 4 or 5 academic units who are doing hope work, but we're the ones focused on trauma.
Does your organization provide technical assistance to assist agencies to become hope focused? And is there funding we could apply for this to support this?
So the first part of the question, the answer is yes. So we have a very specific phased training program for working with organizations. First phase is what we call kind of a keynote, kind of like what we're doing here, where you just create sort of an opportunity to expose key stakeholders very briefly into this concept of hope. Then sort of in parallel, we do an executive leadership training along with a hope awareness training for staff. And it's the executive leadership training that really begins to identify the target areas for the Hope Navigator process. So we do have we don't really do it as a cookie cutter. We really a la carte it for the agency and their specific needs. In terms of funding for that, we're seeing an increase in interest of private family foundations in supporting this work because the data is very consistent and very positive. In terms of, I'm really excited because very recently, over last year or so, OVC actually targeted demonstration activity around hope-centered frameworks. So I think there's an increase in that funding, but I don't have like this is the funder you should go to today. But funders, I can tell you our experience is that funders are interested, again, because the return on investment is fairly easy to articulate.
Okay, the next question is, what about using hope as a prevention tool with regards to mental well-being in high-stress jobs such as law enforcement that typically bottle up repeated exposure to trauma?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And that really is the target of the an OVC initiative that we're working on now. I will tell you that historically in the past, we have worked with the Department of Defense to integrate hope into some of these trainings. There are a couple of published studies through the University of Penn that actually demonstrates that hope, among other character strengths, actually promote a reduction in things like post-traumatic stress for deployed soldiers and our fighting force of men and women, as well as better promotion and evaluation, performance evaluation. So within the law enforcement context, I think we have to be very intentional in partnering with creating trust and collaboration so that we can do this work with intention and well. But we know from many published studies that hope has significant and profound positive effects on the reduction of depression, reduction of anxiety, the increase in well-being, improvement in coping strategies to daily related stress. So the overall research in that area, Bill, is robust and very positive, very well established.
Okay, I think I see maybe one more question. My friend hates when people say, I hope that this work, or I hope I can get this done. He makes hope a dream or an impossibility. Is he just short-sighted in the idea of hope as a mindset, and trauma has him in disbelief?
Well, so, I think we have to be very intentional and just put out on the table first and foremost, when I use the word hope, everybody around me who is not familiar with the science of hope is interpreting my term as wishing. And so I totally get the skepticism. I totally appreciate the idea that, that again, I hope there are no tornadoes today. I hope you are well. It's such an ingrained way in which we communicate with each other that one of the things that we've built for Hope Navigators and as part of our training is really an elevator speech format of how to do this hope talk. And what I would argue for is for us to be even a little bit more intentional instead of just using the word hope, that we talk about the science of hope. First of all, it sort of creates a kind of a shock value that there's this whole science behind it. But, there's a clear distinction between wishing and hoping. There's a clear distinction between fantasy, wishing, and hoping, and that's what our training really focuses on. I do want to add another thing, that when we do this training, we actually do encourage and lean into the skeptical perspective of this language and this science. Give us an opportunity to share that science with you. We also know that in some instances, there may be individuals who are just not going to connect with this, and they're going to be very resistant. And we are pretty open and blunt about, announcing that, if there's an individual who just isn't going to lean into this and lean into the science, we kind of put it right back on them and say, if you can't lean into it, that's fine. Just don't be the person that sucks the hope out of the rest of the people in your organization. Don't be that person.
Great, thank you. I believe that we hit all the questions. So did you, Dr. Hellman or Dr. Pharris, did you have any other closing remarks before we go to reminders?
I'll go ahead and just highlight that one of the things that we're very, very focused on is making sure that all of the hope nurturing activities are accessible to everybody, and just that our perspective is that hope is not the outcome, and that through all of this work, at the end of the day, it has to promote and lead to actionable steps that members of an organization can take. It has to be actionable. So again, that is our focus. I certainly appreciate everybody taking the time out of the schedule to listen to this introduction, and greatly appreciate that. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Pharris.
I don't really have anything to add other than, we look forward, some of you have a continued interest in learning about hope and how to implement the strategies in your organization. We just look forward to seeing you in Tulsa.
Great, thank you so much, both of you, for your presentation. Just a few quick announcements before we wrap up. We're about to launch a poll question, so if you could please address the question to support our logistical planning, we'd really appreciate it. The next informational and pre-work webinar, which is a repeat of this webinar, is scheduled for August 31st from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern. And please share this webinar announcement with any of your colleagues or stakeholders or other community teams that may be interested. If you plan to attend the September 14th, 15th in-person Hope Navigation Training in Tulsa, we request you please complete the registration form. The link to the registration form is now in the chat. The presentation recording and presentation slides will be distributed via the listserv, the OVC TTA listserv, and on the Navigator dashboard, which I believe the link is also in the chat to the dashboard. Yes, it is, in the coming days. Please stay tuned for updates on logistical details of the in-person Hope Navigation training, including the meeting location and lodging information. And if you have any other questions at any time, you can reach out to us at obc-tta@jbsinternational.com. I think we're going to go ahead and launch the poll now. And thank you so much, everybody, and you have a great rest of your week and weekend.